Good evening, everyone. We only have one mic for the sound system, and it's a lapel mic. So we've already got Darren all mic'd up. So I'm going to give my intro comments and project as well as I can. So hopefully everyone in the back can hear me. We're all good? Okay. Good evening again. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ian Wilson. I teach religious studies at the U of A's Augustana campus, just down that way. And I also direct the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, which is hosting this event tonight. So I'd like to welcome you all to the Camrose Public Library. And before I introduce our guest tonight, I'd like to thank the library for graciously hosting us and for the hard work that went into setting up all these chairs. So thank you very much to the library staff who has supported us on a number of occasions now. We've developed a pretty good working relationship with them. I think this is a great venue for hosting public events. If you're not a regular visitor to the library, I encourage you all to do so. We have some really great programming, some really great content here in our library, so please visit the library as often as you can. Before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather, traditionally known as Siniscal-Sapesis, or Stony Creek, is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many indigenous peoples. The land on which this library is located provided a traveling route and home to the Musqueam, Nahiwak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and other indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and our life as a community. Tonight we have the privilege of learning from Dr. Darren Dochuk of Notre Dame University, who is this semester's Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Chester Ronning Center. Darren is Associate Professor in the History Department at Notre Dame. Before working there, he held academic posts at Purdue University, Southern Methodist University, and Washington University in St. Louis, among other institutions. That said, he's also a Canadian and an Albertan to boot. Darren grew up in Edmonton, and he was educated at Simon Fraser University in BC and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Most recently, he is the author of this book, Anointed with Oil: How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, which was published this year by Basic Books, and which is available for purchase here tonight in the back. In the book's epilogue, Darren comments that having grown up in Alberta, in Canada's oil country, he's basically been thinking about this topic his entire life. In the book, he examines what he calls wildcat oil explorers of the American West, whose strident individualism amidst booms and busts in the oil patch found a fruitful partner in certain Christian visions of the end of the world. The unexpected ups and downs of oil extraction mapped well onto theological ideas of future tribulations in anticipation of Christ's eventual return. He contrasts these wildcats with the evangelical and ecumenical Protestantism of the Rockefellers, for example, who saw Christianity and the oil industry working hand in hand for global good. Rather than focusing on the unpredictable cycles of boom and bust and any coming apocalypse, Rockefeller and his company, the famous Standard Oil, sought to utilize their industrial influence to bring order to the world, the social gospel wed with newly emerging global capitalism. In both cases, Darren's historical work shows how the process of resource extraction was tied to Christian faith in a kind of manifest destiny, whether that destiny was imagined regionally or globally, as something wild and chaotic, or as a, pun intended, well-oiled bureaucracy. One might ask, hasn't Christianity impacted pretty much everything in the recent history of North America? What's so special about religion's impact on oil? But Darren's work shows in great detail how these specific theological connections between boom-bust cycles and apocalypticism, between global capitalism and evangelical Protestantism, make the relationship between Christianity and oil particularly important in our history, especially in places like Alberta. The book, which I'll mention it briefly again, is for sale in the back corner. The book focuses mainly on the States, but tonight Darren is going to share with us some of his thoughts on the Albertan context where similar sorts of relationships between Christianity and oil are readily apparent in the historical record. So I look forward to those thoughts, and I'll turn the floor over to him. So please welcome me in joining Darren tonight.
Thank you, Ian, for that wonderful summary and of some of the main points of the book. And thank you for the invitation. Thanks also to Diane and Catherine and the Ronning Center. It's a real privilege to be back here in Camrose. I was thinking today of when I was here last, and I think I was 10 or 12 years old. But I do remember visiting Camrose at that point to hear a talk at Camrose Lutheran. So great to be back. Thanks also to the Camrose Public Library. Can you hear me at the back? Oh, awesome. All right, 2 thumbs up. Well, as you just heard, I come to this project through a certain personal history. I came of age, if you will, in the 1980s when we were dealing with a certain bus cycle in oil. We had this other prime minister by the name of Trudeau who was trying to nationalize. We had OPEC and we had Saudis and some of the tensions around the globe really kind of resonated with me as a youngster attending a church at the time who heard these stories of doom in the pews and made these connections perhaps intuitively between kind of the rise and fall of the oil sector in Alberta and what it meant institutionally, culturally, for my very community, including my church community. So as I looked for a second project, I had just finished a first book that looked at Texas and California and the rise of conservatism, conservative politics. I kept coming across these connections between oil and religion. So on a scholarly level, I thought it would be worth pursuing this further, and then of course with the personal background. So it's good to be back. Seems to be yet here we go again with some of the same tensions over oil politics. Talking with family on Monday night, I felt like I was back in the 1980s in some regard with certain tensions rising once again. So I hope you'll find this to be a timely talk. What I do in the book, and I certainly don't have an opportunity to give you the full overview, I just want to catch a snippet or two of it, which does place Alberta at the center, at the heart of the story, and indeed Alberta does factor largely in the book for reasons, again, partly because of my own personal background. Hope to show, though, again, the way that energy and energy sources are imagined in highly sacred terms, by many at least, turning them into theological and moral, not just political imperatives. Also seek to show in this book how the way that religious institutions base in energy frontiers like Alberta will exercise certain dependency on those energy sources and also emerge as their advocates as well. So this relationship between religion and oil that I map out in this book is ideological, theological, it's institutional, and it has major political consequences, certainly if you look at the United States, both domestically and on a global stage as well. Let me again just offer you a glimpse, and we need to begin at the macro level, if you will. And Ian mentioned the Rockefellers. This is very much the Rockefeller side of the story. And I want to, while we will kind of step back for a bit into an earlier time period, focus on the mid-20th century, really between the 1930s and the 1960s, when some very important things were happening in American oil and the oil industry especially. First of all, I want to highlight a divide for you that I think is much more trenchant and important to understanding the U.S. oil industry, and that is a divide between major oil companies and independents. And again, there's a certain fluidity between those two categories, mid-majors and so forth. But historically, at least, this has been a very important divide within U.S. oil. We think of American oil as big oil, as in monolithic terms, but in fact, it has been a highly contested, competitive industry throughout. And that is because early on in the late 19th century, of course, the rule of capture in the United States was a legal canon unique to U.S. at that time, really justified each individual's right to pursue this material really on their terms and to drain pools, even those underneath your neighbors, with a certain ferocity. So it was, oil in the 19th century was incredibly competitive. It was the ultimate kind of free enterprise, free market capitalism at work at that juncture. We know kind of what happens. The Rockefellers come along, John D. Rockefeller Sr., and he decides that he is going to find a way to impose order on this very chaotic landscape. He creates Standard Oil. By 1890, Standard Oil controls over 90% of all oil refining in the United States, squeezing out thousands of small oil producers who up to that point had been at work in the first frontier of oil in the United States, which was Western Pennsylvania. All right, that leads to this divide between these two sectors. Going forward, Rockefeller and Standard Oil will eventually be broken apart by the courts in 1911 because of its monopoly. Out of which, though, will come several dozens of other kind of standard offshoots. And the Rockefellers, the spirit of the Rockefellers, the very presence of the Rockefellers through their investment in these subsequent companies will continue, but in other forms. By the mid-20th century, we have kind of a consolidation of at least 7 large major companies, fully integrated in their capacity, whether it be production and refining or transportation and marketing, fully integrated and also transnational, multinational. 3 of those, as you can see here, are offshoots of Standard Oil. So the legacy really continues. In the mid-20th century, what is important here is that these companies decide to cast their gaze, especially the American ones, which is new for them, at least with the intensity that they're going to do so, cast their gaze globally and start opening up fields in the Middle East, for instance, none more important than in Saudi Arabia in the 1930s and 1940s. This is led by the American Standard offshoots. So this is really the new vision of global oil that is supported by, among others, Harold Ickes, who is the Secretary of Interior at that time and really the oil czar for the Franklin D. Roosevelt New Deal government. He sees domestic production as dropping off and he declares it imperative to move American attentions abroad and to really essentially make the United States an oil importer from these foreign oil producing states. There is kind of a religious, again, angle to this, I would argue. The Rockefellers are going to certainly continue to represent kind of the spirit of these large major oil companies. They're going to maintain their shares in these companies and again, kind of impose their own global, internationalist, cosmopolitan vision of development, modernization, scientific modernization through the advancement of oil exploration, all under the control, of course, of these large American companies. Now, the Rockefellers themselves are deeply devout. John D. Sr. was, of course, a very devout Baptist and very evangelical. His son, though, is going to, John D. Rockefeller Jr., kind of advance a more liberal, modernist, if you will, understanding of Protestantism. Kind of a civil religion of crude, as I call it, which expresses confidence in collective action that is endorsed in church pews and beyond. It's a social gospel of human uplift through application of modern science and technology. It's optimistic, it's post-millennial, the notion that humans bonded together across boundaries could come together and prepare the world for the millennium after which Christ will return. So it's ecumenical, it's internationalist, it's monopolistic in a way, and that's how the opponents to the Rockefellers would view it. The opportunity and the priority to consolidate, to bring churches together, to bring denominations together for this grand vision, a global internationalist vision. And he is going to, of course, Rockefeller is going to act on that through charity, more so than his father. In fact, his father is going to be a wonderful multitasker in the church and in his corporation. John D. Rockefeller Jr. realizes early that he's not cut out for the oil business, so where is he going to channel his energies? It's into philanthropy, and it's into the creation of a sprawling Rockefeller apparatus of charity that's going to focus, again, on science, on health, technology. This is how you build a new world. And it's going to be locked again, really kind of locked together with the profits of these large oil companies and with the very vision that these oil companies take abroad to places like the Middle East, where they're going to count, for instance, on the knowledge of local missionaries and to bring together missionaries with other experts in the field to build a large company like Aramco that is sensitive to the kind of multiculturalism of this region and the religious faith of this region as well. Passed on from John D. Rockefeller Jr., of course, is going to be the 5 Rockefeller brothers who are going to create the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, something perhaps you've heard about in the news as we talk about the oil sands, which we will in just a few minutes. And these, again, 5 sons extended this vision of big oil attached to big religion on a global stage, and did so through promotion of a number of economic development projects and their own involvement in government. So that is just a glimpse at the one side of this story. And again, I do not have time to dig in. I'd be happy to talk further about this. But for our purposes today, if we want to understand the Alberta situation as well, I want to turn to the other side of this equation. It is about those small independent oil producers who were forced out of Western Pennsylvania across the Mississippi in the 1880s and 1890s. Many of them, like John D. Rockefeller Sr., very devout, very evangelical, fervently evangelical and individualistic in their faith in a Christ that can provide salvation, again, on a very personal level. They're also fiercely independent in their business. They are protective of their rights. They accept kind of the speculative and risk dimensions of their work more willingly than the Rockefellers. They want to protect their rule of capture. They are attuned to crisis. As Ian says, there's a certain eschatology at work. Their understanding of boom-bust cycles as somewhat natural to their industry, the willingness to endure it. There is a respect for the mysteries and the supernatural workings in the world. And there is a theology of personal encounter with an active creator, with the mysteries of an earth whose hidden riches enchant and elude reason. So this is kind of the kind of mindset of so many of these individuals. Now they move west of the Mississippi. They're mocked by Standard Oil. In fact, John Archbold, president in the 1890s, says he will drink every gallon of crude west of the Mississippi. This is how sure he is that oil does not exist west of the Mississippi. Standard Oil, as a result, thanks to their geological experts, are actually going to refrain from really moving into the west. We know the rest of the story. There is just a bit of oil west of the Mississippi, right? In Southern California, 1890s, of course, we get the first big booms, Los Angeles being one of the first in 1893. And then in 1901, the biggest of them all takes place at Spindletop in southeast Texas, right on the Gulf Coast, just south of Beaumont. This is monumental. Biggest strike in history up to that point, puts Texas on the map as the new epicenter of oil production. Well, who is there to strike it rich? It's these small independent producers who have attacked the soil with all intent and energy, convinced that oil actually does exist out west. And so as a result, after 1900, their vision of industry, their fervent independence, whether it's in the church pew or in their corporate sector, is going to gain leverage and allow them to compete with the majors, if not on equal footing, then on more sure footing. And most importantly, very much impose, again, their worldview on the oil patch of Texas and eventually of Oklahoma. Well, there to lead them on is going to be this figure here, J. Howard Pugh. J. Howard Pugh, and this story again is typical of the larger one I tell. He is the son of Joseph Pugh, pictured below. Joseph Pugh starts Sun Oil, or simply Sunoco. You might be familiar with the signs. Devoutly Presbyterian family, evangelical Presbyterian, product of Western Pennsylvania. But Sunoco is going to flounder early on because of the Rockefellers and Standard, and eventually they're going to be driven to Ohio, where they kind of survive just barely in the new pools that emerged there in the 1890s. But what's going to be their lifeline is Spindletop. They are going to be one of the first families and oil companies on the spot, ready to take advantage of Spindletop, Texas. In 1912, it's going to be J. Howard Pugh, son of Joseph Pugh, who is going to take leadership of Sunoco and again kind of reinforced this wildcat Christianity, this rabidly evangelical vision that he has, and is going to kind of infuse his corporate culture with that. At the base, of course, this animus against the Rockefellers, the animus against big oil and monopolies, and also what he sees going on in the church, thanks to the Rockefellers, in his estimation, a secular drift, a drift to liberal modernism. All of this is going to animate his corporate and eventually philanthropic dealings going forward. It's also going to animate his politics. Tomorrow I'll talk a bit more about what happens in 1930s East Texas. Well, you thought Spindletop was big. What happens over the decade of the 1930s in East Texas is even bigger. One of the poorest regions of the country is going to experience an oil boom like none other, making this region a destination for all who are suffering from the Depression at this time. Because of that, of the 22,000 wells drilled in East Texas in the 30s, a vast majority are going to be by independents like Sunoco and J. Howard Pugh. Now, why is this important politically? Because of the New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harold Ickes' efforts to bring this field under control by, for instance, imposing very costly conservation methods. Now, conservation is something that can be handled by the majors much more than smaller companies. This is much more costly for them. Their wildcatting, drilling for wildcat wells, is highly risk intensive. And so this makes them vulnerable. So this, among other things, kind of a fear of encroaching federal government, is going to spur J. Howard Pugh on, as you see him speaking here before Congress, I believe, to fight back against the federal state. Emerging at this point then is this fiercely independent evangelicalism, wildcat Christianity, affixed now to an anti-Washington, anti-New Deal liberal state. And that is going to be the roots of a conservative movement that is going to grow in the post-World War II period, and is going to grow because of the monies and the interests and certainly the aggressiveness of this class of independent oilmen that J. Howard Pugh is going to lead. Now, Pugh, as I said, is going to turn his attention in the late 40s, 1947. He is going to retire from the head of Sunoco, but he's going to be still in place as chair of the board. So he's still going to have a say, a big say, a major say, in fact, the say within the corporate structure going forward. But what he is wanting to turn his attention to is philanthropy. He is determined now to build a trust that can counter the Rockefellers in the church and in the philanthropic sector. Now, he can't compete on an equal plane, but he is going to do his best to dole out his profits to support conservative evangelical causes, especially conservative Catholic ones as well, including those of William Buckley Jr., who is the son of a wildcatter, a Catholic wildcatter from Texas. And Pugh is going to, again, funnel his funds in those directions. Now, the most important recipient of this is going to be a collection of associations and organizations and individuals that are representative of what's being called the new evangelicalism of the 1940s. Prior to this, conservative Protestants in the United States consider themselves fundamentalists. In the 1940s, with rising status, economic status, with more ability to build institutions and to evangelize on a mass scale, we see a new kind of class, a new generation of evangelicals emerge. They want to be more irenic. They want to engage American culture and politics rather than avoid them, which is what more separatist fundamentalists had done before this. So this movement emerges in the 40s. There's some, again, representatives of this. Christianity Today is going to become really the most important magazine for new evangelicalism. There's going to be, is this a light? The formation of the National Association of Evangelicals, which is going to be really the clearinghouse for evangelical concerns, including in Washington. And there's also going to be the emergence of really very popular radio evangelists, none more popular than Charles Fuller, out of Pasadena, California, who in the 1940s is going to command an audience of roughly 20 million. Charles Fuller wants to build the ultimate seminary, Fuller Seminary, that's representative of this more centrist, moderate, culturally engaged evangelical Protestantism. Well, now, incidentally, this is a side note, Fuller himself is going to look for a way to fund his seminary. Where do you think he's going to turn? To his own oil company. He's going to build an oil company. He's going to call it Providential Oil. In the late 1940s, early 50s. Unfortunately, it's going to fail in the early 50s. He's almost going to have, he has a severe stress attack over it. He bemoans the fact that Christ hasn't blessed him with oil. But where is he going to turn once his own company fails? He's going to turn to J. Howard Pugh. And J. Howard Pugh is going to be the one who funds Christianity Today. He's going to be one of the most high-profile members of the National Association of Evangelicals. So this is the coming together of, again, a certain type of oil and resource capitalism. It's the coming together with a particular worldview that's embodied in the National Association of Evangelicals, and it's going to have, of course, a political intent as well. And the political intent is going to be focused on turning really the Republican Party into the party of independent oil, of wildcat Christianity. And that's going to be a process that unfolds over the coming years. So how does this new evangelicalism look circa 1947, circa 1955? Well, of course, another ultimate symbol of this is Billy Graham. The emergence of Reverend Billy Graham, a young evangelist in the early 40s, makes it big in Los Angeles in 1949. Thereafter, he is going to be the face of the new evangelicalism. And he himself is also going to recognize quite early where the life source is, at least financially, for this movement. He is going to basically set up a second home in the Southwest. He's going to change his membership, for instance, from North Carolina to First Baptist Dallas, which is going to be home to the most powerful independent oilmen in the state at that time, thanks to their own work in the 1930s East Texas fields. Billy Graham is going to become very close with many of these individuals, Sid Richardson being one of them, for instance. He's also going to honor them through his ministry in the first years of this ministry. Perhaps some of you know Billy Graham is going to start a movie company, a movie corporation in the early 50s, meant to show movies again of inspiration at his revivals around the world. His first one is going to be called Mr. Texas. It's the story of a Texan kind of roughneck who comes to Christ and turns his life over to Christ. That's going to speak to the likes of Sid Richardson, who is going to, again, in his own kind of rough and tumble way, decide that he needs to make this kind of decision, and is going to become a close ally of Billy Graham going forward. Billy Graham's second movie is called Oil Town, USA, and it's about Houston in the early 50s. Once again, the story of wildcatters gone awry, wildcatters gone wrong. But just think, if we bring them back to the fold and they accept Christ as their personal Savior, imagine the possibilities of what they can do for America, for American Christianity. And that's basically the message of the movie, and it is funded by oilmen in Texas. So this is, again, Billy Graham very much in the lead here, providing certain counsel to these men, but also partnering with them, and you'll see in some very substantial ways. A third individual, I think, kind of representative of the new evangelicalism is R.G. Letourneau. Anyone know of that name? Okay, R.G. Letourneau. Billy Graham is about evangelizing the gospel of new evangelicalism, promoting missions, revivals, trying to bring individuals to Christ. This is how you change society. In the meantime, engineers like R.G. Letourneau, who has Canadian roots, would build one of the most successful land-moving equipment companies in America in the first half of the 20th century. During World War II, 70% of the equipment used abroad would be built by R.G. Letourneau. So Letourneau is a very successful engineer, and he sees it as his project not just to evangelize, but to create kind of a mission of engineering the world into a better place, to engineer it, to prepare it for the spread of Christian democracy and capitalism. A number of projects speak to this. He is going to, again, pictured there with his land moving equipment, set up a school and his largest factory in East Texas in the 40s, because there he knows he has access to the oil industry. There he is also going to build engineering offshore rigs. First mobile offshore rig, I believe in '54, is built by R.G. Letourneau. It's built for Zapata Oil. I don't know if you recognize these two individuals, Bush Sr., of course, and a younger George W. at the christening of this. So this is how he wants to, again, spread his faith and change and transform the world. He's also going to do so abroad in Peru, where he buys up, I want to say, 1 million acres, or acquires it from the Peruvian government. Now, the Peruvian government wants to open up the hinterland for oil exploration, and the one way to do it is by building roads into that region. R.G. Letourneau's got his hands up, willing to do the job, to allow for exploration on the condition that he gets land to create a self-sustaining community as a model of evangelicalism and as a model of Christian democracy. Okay, so again, God and black gold very much kind of coming together in this foreign enterprise. These individuals are going to be at the forefront of some of the important engineering marvels that take place in oil itself in the late 40s and 50s. And here's where we'll turn quite quickly here to Alberta. 1947, this combination of Christian oilmen, evangelists and pastors and engineers coming together to help promote the cause of independent oil. So as majors are going internationally, independents are saying we need to focus on the domestic. This is where America can ensure its protections against communism. Of course, this is the Cold War backdrop. This is where we can promote energy security, national security, again, something that registers very much with today. And in 1947, two events are going to take place thanks to their ingenuity. First is the first kind of offshore oil strike in the Gulf of Mexico. It's carried out by a company owned by Robert Kerr, who is the leading Southern Baptist layman of his generation. He's also a very successful businessman with KerrMcGee, and he is also governor and eventually senator of Oklahoma. Combination that's going to prove very powerful. 1947 discovery in the Gulf is going to drive other oil companies into that region, and there, of course, is going to create its own history, including a political history of the 1950s. That same year, another strike occurs. Anyone know where? Leduc, right. So even as this sector of oil is looking south, looking to the north as well. Now, in this case, it's Imperial Oil with some connections, of course, to a major company. But it immediately is going to put Alberta on the map. This here is going to become a destination for all oil companies, but especially independents of J. Howard Pugh's variety. Alberta can be, in their estimation, the alternative to Saudi Arabia. Not only that, it can be a true testament to the virtues of evangelical Christianity and capitalism, free market capitalism, in the face of the communist menace. So they start to flock to this region. Now, this gets us to, of course, one of the most important gentlemen in this relationship. And all four of these, representing kind of different sectors of the new evangelicalism, know each other very closely. R.G. Letourneau and Ernest Manning, pictured in the right, are dear friends working in a number of different Christian businessmen associations. Preston Manning and Billy Graham are personal friends as well. And he is also, of course, most eager to bring together evangelists like Charles Fuller up to Alberta to hold revivals. In fact, the same year as the Leduc strike, Charles Fuller comes up, and Manning in some ways pauses his work to welcome Fuller here to Alberta. The story behind this, of course, is social credit. Ernest Manning is trained by William Aberhart, the leader of the Social Credit Party, the most successful populist movement in North American history. This is a movement really takes root in the 1930s, especially in rural Alberta, kind of a platform of redistribution of money, a platform of anti-corporation, anti-big business, anti-Ottawa in many ways, and a focus on the virtues of community life, surrounded by really a focus and emphasis on traditional evangelical Protestantism. This is what Eberhard envisions for this party, for this movement, and again, we know how successful it's going to be. Manning is going to train at the Prophetic Institute that is started by Eberhard. He's also going to become a preacher very much in the same ilk as William Eberhard. Where Manning is going to differ, however, is in the way he's going to share his faith and preach his faith. In many ways, he is the new evangelical to Eberhard's fundamentalist. Manning is more irenic, is more centrist, and he wants to share his faith and change and transform Canadian and American culture by engaging it. He's also, of course, very determined when he becomes premier suddenly in 1943. Now, before that, he's Minister of Minerals in Alberta, so he's always aware of the importance of developing this industry in Alberta. As he becomes premier, he is determined to also shift social credit slightly to make it, and increasingly it will become more friendly to corporate capitalism and more determined to redefine the Alberta economy away from its rural base to an industry base, to modernize. And the Leduc strike in 1947 is going to spur him on. Oil is the way to envision a new Alberta future, a future again in which the values of this pioneering yesteryear can still be protected and shored up. Manning is indeed going to become a hero of sorts, not just to independent oilmen and evangelicals in the Southwest, but across the United States. And through the 1950s and 1960s, he is going to become a very popular preacher. And he will speak on weekdays in oil associations across the Southwest, and then on Sunday in churches. This is the way he sells this message. This is the way he sells Alberta, really, to the cousins as he sees it in Texas and Oklahoma. And Texans and Oklahomans and people, evangelicals across the United States, are really going to celebrate him as a model of practical Christianity, of someone who is focused on the well-being of North America, North American Christians, and who wants to build a better future. This is a quote also, I think, just illustrating the importance he is going to put on oil. This comes out of Billy Graham's magazine in 1962. Alberta is the great oil-producing province of Canada, yet every time I look at an oil well and see the pump going up and down, I say to myself, someday that well will be pumped dry, but there is a cruise of oil which will never run dry, one that will flow on forever and ever. We should be anxious for people to know about the oil, which in the lamp of God's word produces a light that shines across the darkness of this world in order that men may find their way to Jesus Christ, the one who alone can save and who can solve their problems, whatever they may be. That's typical of the message, using oil as an example, as metaphor for the importance of personal salvation in Christ, a sense of an impending end. He was a premillennialist, dispensationalist. He knew that Christ was going to return suddenly amid cataclysm. His was not the optimistic view of a Rockefeller. And he knew that oil, souls and soil needed to be acquired and taken advantage of saved in the here and now before Christ returned. And that gave him, again, a certain urgency to his management of the oil business itself. How does this translate? In a couple of ways. First of all, of course, he is going to promote the conventional oil industry throughout the 1950s going forward, and he will be successful. By 1960, I believe 18% of imported oil into the U.S. is coming from Alberta or from Canada, not from Saudi Arabia. So he's going to, again, prove to be very effective at this. But the second way is going to be connected to his even grander vision of oil in Alberta, of making Alberta, again, a shining example of freedom, of Christian democracy, and as a counter to Saudi Arabia and other Cold War pressures around the world. He's going to set his eyes on the oil sands of Athabasca. Now, Since the early 20th century, of course, the sands had been explored. The challenge, of course, was coming up with the technology to be able to harness the energy from this field. Technology seems to be catching up in the 1940s, and Manning is made aware of this and has decided that he is going to pursue investment in a project in the oil sands. The federal government had been managing a project that failed in the 1940s. He wants the province to take over. Again, in many ways, his social credit mentality is rising here. He wants Alberta to be in charge of what he thinks is its God-given mineral resources and resource wealth. So he starts looking for someone to invest. Well, this is a pretty costly venture, as we know. The only one to step up is J. Howard Pugh, who in 1952 pulls a file out of his filing cabinet. He was obsessed with the Athabasca oil sands. His head geologist said, we need to be aware of this. Finally, the opportunity emerges in the early 1950s, and he writes a check for $250 million to start the Great Canadian Oil Sands. This was the largest private investment in Canada up to this point. Over the 50s, the 1950s, the project, of course, is going to stall. There's a number of reasons for this. The economics of oil. Conventional oil is worried that oil sands will steal from their profits, really. And there wasn't a demand for it, nor the technology to make this very difficult extraction process viable. One of the things that's tested is nuclear energy to try to kind of liquefy the sands. It's proving to be very controversial in the late 50s, and so they do not move forward with that. In the meantime, Manning and Pugh develop a very close relationship, and it is all very much premised on their shared Christian beliefs. I spent days in the Pugh archives and the Manning archives, weeks, reading the letters that flowed back and forth. One recommending a couple of books on Calvin, another on the virtues and importance of prayer. J. Howard Pugh loved to deliver sermons and prayers at the company Christmas party, and his favorite was one that he borrowed from Manning himself, who had wrote this. In Pugh's estimation, it was the most beautiful sermon he had ever heard. So this is how this relationship develops, and it's going to prove to be critical in the early 1960s when it is decided in 63, Pugh comes to Fort McMurray and decides it's time to move forward. He's getting certain promises from the Alberta government. This seems to be a moment when the technology is catching up, as well as the difficult economics of this. It hits a snag, though, in 64. And, of course, this is a much more complex interchange involving several different leaders in this business, but Pugh by far is really the most important, as is Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning is going to return to his populist roots in 63 and 64, and he's going to remain skeptical that a big company from the United States should come into Alberta and extract our oil. The social credit in him is not gone entirely. He's softening to kind of free market business mechanisms, but he is hesitant to subject Alberta to American power in that way. So he demands certain concessions. He wants guarantees of Alberta labor to be protected. He wants pipelines. He wants royalties for the Alberta people, all of which makes J. Howard Pugh very skeptical. And here again is the anti-statism of Pugh kicking in. Pugh is wary that the Alberta government is going to take too much power away from him and away from his corporate interests. And so the relationship kind of stalls. Enter Billy Graham. In 1965, I believe, Billy Graham and J. Howard Pugh and Ernest Manning meet in Jasper, where they play a round of golf and share stories. J. Howard Pugh is excited. He's shot 82, his age, which is actually a pretty big accomplishment. And there they decide, for instance, that Billy Graham should come to Canada and hold a series of revivals across the country. And this is what Manning is envisioning. Meanwhile, Manning and Pugh get a chance to chat. I don't know exactly what they chatted about, but remarkably, the relationship, once again, was strengthened, and the tensions between these two visions, the Alberta government and Sunoco, is softened, and the project moves forward. R.G. Letourneau's equipment is among those that makes its way to the oil sands from Texas, and by 1967, this project is christened, and it is christened in quite spectacular fashion. with several prayers and invocations offered at the opening ceremonies. Again, just kind of reaffirming the relationship of God and black gold in this very ambitious venture. And in '67, again, this is heralded as a global success story, putting Alberta once again at the forefront of an emerging international oil sector. I won't take too much more time. I want to leave opportunity for questions. Going forward, of course, the oil sands project is not going to be an entire success. It's going to hit some fits and starts in the 1970s before the government's going to step in the 1980s. But even in the early 70s, it's still going to be envisioned in much the same way that Manning envisioned it. This is in no small part because of Sunoco's rapport with Harry Strom, who is going to become Premier of Alberta after Manning retires in the late 60s. One of the first trips that Strom is going to make is after accepting the premiership is to Washington, D.C., where he attends Richard Nixon's presidential prayer breakfast, an event assisted by Graham and Pugh. Strom returned home, determined to make his religion count in the political realm. Alberta citizens who continued to hold firm to the social credit's political and religious heritage hailed his devotion. Quote, "In its new leader, the province of Alberta has a man for whom the word honor carries a deeper meaning. The Honorable Henry Strom, Premier of Alberta, seeks also to honor Jesus Christ." Strom stayed loyal to Sunoco. In 1970, he reduced the royalties it was required to pay, easing the company's burdens, but stirring the wrath of political opponents, including Grant Notley, who said that the act was an outrageous concession to a subsidiary of a giant multinational corporation. Sunoco officials monitored the backlash and behind the scenes negotiated all the more urgently with Strom. In one of the last meetings of his life, J. Howard Pugh convened with Strom in May 1970, at which time Strom pledged to help the Canadian Oil Sands Company regardless of the heat. Despite being in the middle of planning Honor America Day, which brought 400,000 Christians to Washington, D.C. in a sign of Christian patriotism, Pugh decided to meet with Strom. Considered the meeting with Strom as essential. Pugh would die just a short time later, bringing in some ways an end to the story. But we continue on with it today, and I am going to not spend time on more recent controversies other than to say that the story of religion and oil continues in Alberta, and it continues in no small part because of the work that J. Howard Pugh and Ernest Manning did in the 1950s and 1960s. There's yet another side to this narrative, one that I do outline in the book, and that is those carbon-free gospelers, those anti-oilers who also wore their faith on their sleeve, starting with Ida Tarbell in the 1900s, who would write the muckraking journalist takedown of Standard Oil. Her father was one of those independent oilmen who was abused by Standard, was driven out of the business, and literally driven into depression. She watched her father suffer at the hands of Rockefeller and said enough is enough, and she took down Rockefeller, forcing the 1911 dissolution. Devoutly Methodist, someone who brought her Methodism and Quaker faith with her into her critique of this industry and ultimately of the human and environmental disaster that, at least in Western Pennsylvania, it created. In some ways, her legacy is passed on to the present. We can list off those who are part of the activism against the oil sands, against the Keystone Pipeline, which again also has its ties to this longer history. Bill McKibben prides himself as a Methodist Sunday school teacher who is also bringing his kind of carbon-free gospel evangelism to the movement, and having, again, a very definitive, serious effect, of course, on Alberta itself. Again, whether it's protesting the Keystone or the tar sands, there is a way in which the moral fervor of this activism has, again, a longer history that takes us back to the 19th century. One irony in that our recent activism is two enemies becoming allies. Two of the kind of funding agencies behind a good deal of the protests, as you may know, in Alberta, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Pew Trust. J. Howard Pugh, of course, would be rolling in his grave if he knew that the trust that he started up to promote his particular brand of conservative Christianity has, since the 1990s, taken on environmental causes as among its most important. And now, alongside the Rockefellers, locked arm in arm, they are fighting the very project that J. Howard Pugh created. An irony, I think, that just accentuates, again, the entanglements of faith and oil in this long history, one in which Alberta is very much embroiled. I will leave it at that. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. I will moderate if necessary. Darren, though, is welcome to call on folks as questions arise. If I see multiple hands, then I'll try to keep track of folks. But we'll open the floor now. Are there any comments, questions, feedback for Dr. Dochuk?
Well, just on this last part you were mentioning, the Rockefeller Brothers have the greatest opposition to our oil sands.
Right. Well, they do, and that so that stretches back, ever since Rockefeller Sr. Each generation of Rockefellers has grown increasingly wary of the industry that their father or grandfather or great-grandfather actually started. At the same time, they celebrate their great-grandfather. This is a fourth-generation Rockefeller group right here, protesting or calling on divestment by ExxonMobil, I believe. In any case, they also have turned their father's legacy into something to celebrate, and their of course campaign is to say, look, we can embody the same entrepreneurialism of our great-grandfather, but let's channel it now into other clean energy forms. And so there is some irony, some disconnect, but also a legacy there that makes sense. The irony here is just a simple one, and that's the way in which the Pugh legacy now has aligned itself with the Rockefeller legacy. The Pugh, in early 1990s, the Pugh Trust took a very different turn, a new generation of leadership towards, as I say, more kind of liberal causes. So that's simply what I was pointing out there. But
Okay, but then when I read enemies turned allies, I don't know what you're talking about, because if you're talking about that they were Christian, you started off saying that these were both Christians, Christian groups, and then they got to be enemies as Christians or as oil?
J. Howard Pugh did not think John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a Christian. So my point being is there's a sectarian politics internally within the church at this time in which these two sides were warring, and it was bitter. So that's what I meant by enemies, and perhaps that's too strong a word. But no, if J. Howard Pugh was staunch, and especially what he saw Junior and his sons doing, in his estimation, it was leading the United States towards collectivism, secularism, socialism. So that's where that clash takes place. It's rooted in the corporate infighting of the Civil War of oil in the early 20th century, which again is why I use the word enemies. And so
Rockefeller is still at war with our oil sands. I mean, he hates the oil sands.
Right. No, I agree. And what I'm saying is the Pew's, and again, this isn't the Pugh family, this is the Pugh Trust, are on board with that as well. So yes, they are not appreciative of the oil sands.
I was just curious about the Koch brothers, and we haven't heard anything about them. But can you maybe tell us a little bit about where they fit in the enemies as well?
Thank you. Good question. And certainly we hear a lot about the Kochs. And I wrote a piece in Political a few weeks ago when one of the Koch brothers passed away, and said how it was kind of the Pugh brothers. Now, J. Howard Pugh and his brother Joseph Jr. were both very powerful in the Republican Party. And if you come tomorrow, I can tell you a little bit about how they reshaped the Republican Party, and they do so from the 30s to the 60s. The story after that is about the Koch brothers. It's about the Hunts. It's about others as well. So the Kochs have to be in the story to some degree. However, what I would say is they don't necessarily map on to my argument in that they're fiercely libertarian in their politics, but they do not share with the Pews interest as well in some of the religious causes and certainly the religious right causes that the Pews helped bring to the forefront. So that would be the slight difference there. But yeah, in terms of their hatred for or their opposition to Washington and heavy regulation, in terms of their rootedness in the Southwest, in the Mid-Continent, in their opposition to kind of the Rockefeller big business model, at least in principle, the Koch brothers should be part of that.
It's interesting when President or Premier Manning retired, although he was a product of Edmonton and lived there virtually his entire life, he immediately moved to Calgary, the center of the oil business in Canada. Is there a connection?
So the question is, the curiosity that Ernest Manning, when he lived in Edmonton and completed his premiership and moved to Calgary, which of course is the corporate headquarters for oil. Why might that be? Does anyone have anything to offer? I mean, I guess Aberhart's school was in Calgary, right? So he has certain Calgary roots there. Was his wife from?
Aberhart, his school was in Calgary, but that was 45 years before. So.
Right. So I'm just trying to, I'm not sure of Manning's personal connections to Calgary, I guess. But it could be that, again, some of these other connections, perhaps through oil, made him comfortable in Calgary. I don't have an answer to that. But of course, I know he was very prominent in evangelical circles there, as was his son. Yes?
While skiing east of Sherwood Park in sort of a natural area, I came across I think it was a gas wellhead or something, one of those things where the pipes come out of the ground. And there was a curious sign on the fence around it, company sign. Had a black silhouette of some oil derricks or whatever against a red sunset. And underneath it said, Hell's Acre Ltd. So it got me thinking about religion and oil right then and there, and now with your talk, obviously,
right.
In a different way. I guess my question is, are all connections between oil and God Christian, or is there a general religious component to this wildcat capitalism that you're describing that isn't specifically evangelical Christian, or I don't know, or maybe you could just comment on a sign like that.
That's a good question, a great question.
Above or below.
Right. I don't know if I'll be able to repeat that to give it true justice. It's a great comment, and that's one reason why it is a relatively fat book, because it does have other angles to it, and I'm stressing this one tension, which I think is instructive to the larger narrative. As I mentioned at the end, of course, the very notion of oil as opening up the bowels of hell. I mean, the metaphors, the apocalypticism of oil and what it does to society. I mean, again, as I chart in detail, fire, some of the most wrenching catastrophes in American history. One of the most devastating takes place in East Texas in 1937, and it's the New London school disaster. Has anyone heard of that? I'll just briefly. Yeah, so New London is this brand new, it's in East Texas, in the heart of it. They build with oil money this brand new $1 million school, and it is the class of the nation. I mean, school boards around the country are in awe of this place. And on one day, the last session of the day, someone in the machine shop flips on a switch, and it ignites an underground pocket of gas that has been piped in illegally from the oil fields. Now, that was done all over the place. It wasn't a surprise. And this building literally, and you hear testimonies of kids in the other building, one of whom was tying her shoe. She went down to tie her shoe and came up and looked, and what was the building there was, in her eyes, suspended in air, and then it came down crashing on itself. And for 18 hours, all the local oil workers poured in to dig through the rubble, and 300 kids died. And it's to this day still the largest or the most devastating industrial accident. It's the reason why they add malodorants to gas, right? It was for that case. Point being, this is a way of life in oil and the oil patch. And so that had always as well created its own kind of narrative of destruction, of hell. And, you know, for some it was a certain fatalism. We have no choice but to live with this. And if we are going to live with it, let's adopt a religiosity that helps us make sense in this. But for others, it was spurring them on to fight it. So that is another way in which kind of oil is theologized. It's of course, oil lends itself to biblical metaphor, and so there's a certain potency, I think, that you see in oil in a way you don't see in other industries. Lastly, the question about, yes, so I'm stressing, and I won't back down from the fact that it is incredible, I think, the degree to which this kind of wildcat Christianity saturated especially independent oil. Texas, Oklahoma especially, to this day we've got some of the most powerful independent oilmen are the most devoutly evangelical. They are opening up energy fields in Israel, for instance, Texas to Israel. And so I was struck by just how widespread this connection. And so again, it spurred me on to look at just what is it about the oil patch itself that lends itself to that kind of religiosity. Now, it's not the only one. I mentioned in Texas, you know, and that's why I use the term wildcat Christianity, to allow room for Catholics, for instance, such as the Buckley family, fiercely independent oilmen, and of course, to a degree, Jewish as well. I'll end with the comparative offering I provide at the end of the book is just what does this let us know about, or how do we perhaps understand the Middle East and some of the geopolitics there, the ways in which religion and oil there have manifested themselves in fighting of epic proportion, the way in which Saudi Arabia assumes this kind of notion of divine providence from the Rockefeller types and says, no, it is us now who owns our commodity, it's us now who are blessed by God. Well, we know what that means for the politics of the region, so talked enough on that one.
Actually, I have a comment about that. You know, in the Bible, and I wish I could tell you where it is, maybe you will know.
Maybe.
So it says when Christ comes back, he is going to light the oil fields. I think the scripture uses bitumen or...
Bitumen?
It says they will light on fire. And he's talking. He is going to destroy the Middle East countries by lighting the oil on fire in the Middle East. Scripture.
I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar, so I'll
Okay,
defer on that one.
I have it at home.
Well,
I will
And
contact you.
send it to me.
well, what I will just add to that briefly is not to underestimate, so the relationship with Israel, I'll try not to get into too much, but because of the majors moving into Saudi Arabia and Arab-producing countries, they're not allowed to move into Israel. So, and because independents are more limited in their funding, they have limited opportunities globally. So in the 50s, where do they turn but to Israel? Israel, of course, needs oil exploration to take place. They can only turn to the independents, many of whom are devout evangelicals who are said, yeah, we're coming on. We're going to search for this elusive resource, and we're going to do so with the help of our Bibles. And to this day, companies that have biblical names are hard at work there. They're among the most successful, bringing millions and millions of dollars of investment from Texas. Asher Oil. I mean, they're looking to prophecy and they're looking to scripture such as this to not only justify their work there as helping bring energy security and protection to Israel, but also prepare it for Christ's second coming. They are convinced that these biblical passages are speaking about oil. So it has created, this is an institutional, political, economic relationship that transcends just kind of what's being preached from the pulpits. This is also taking place in that regime, at that level.
Just on this issue, I watched a program on ancient history some years ago, and they were talking about Persia and I think Zoroastrianism, predating Christianity, predating Judaism, and there were pockets that were lit on fire, and these became places of temple sites, but gas would be coming out of the ground, and they lit these altars which burned
Right.
for hundreds of years.
Right. No, the question is the relationship. This has been going on. Ancient peoples across that region have identified these pockets of oil and adopted them for their own worship. They would create cities of spectacle in that regard. And so there is this deep relationship between the two. And I could go on about that. Two things. Well, one is, so when, for instance, and I spent a number of weeks in the British Petroleum Archives in London, which was tough to get into in England. And, they're the first into, obviously it's Anglo-Persian at that time. And their geologists, some of the leading bankrollers are using ancient scriptures to identify these pools. So that's where they're going first, and in some cases are successful. So it's not just biblical; it's the ancient religions and its sourcing of this that are also matter as well. A somewhat equivalent on the American scene. So. And like I said, they forced these, Rockefellers forced the small producers west of the Mississippi. Well, already by the 1860s, 1870s, Southerners are looking for the stuff in the Southwest as well. Some are, coming from the Civil War, and like many others are looking for a new start. They see what's happened in Western Pennsylvania. They want to make it big. But among the most important are these kind of amateur geologists who are really natural theologians. And a number of them are Methodist circuit preachers, and they would preach their circuit in Texas, and always observing the land beneath them, tasting it, testing it, and they would write up their studies. And two of the most important were absolutely right on, spot on in saying this area has something special beneath it, and they would be proven correct. So again, bringing Bible, religious experience. And one was convinced. Why? Because he came across this village that was lighting up asphalt, basically bitumen, and burning it in much the same way Zoroastrians did in ancient Persia, and they were using it to provide light for the revival meetings. And he's just like, wait a second, what's going on here? I've seen this stuff before. So, yeah, it's I think a fascinating connection.
As you talked, it struck me that a lot of the theology seemed convenient to perpetuate a certain attitude, lifestyle. Is there any tradition of self-critique or, humility in the face of these vast amounts of resources, either historically or even today, in the midst of the consequences of the environmental consequences of oil production?
Right. No, excellent question. That's one that's asked quite often, especially when you focus on powerful CEOs, as I did tonight. And again, that's just one part of the story. I wouldn't say it's, for some, I think it was convenience. For others, it just legitimated what perhaps they were already obsessed with, and that was a pursuit of profit on their terms. And certainly you see that motivation in a range, in a spectrum, in so many of the individuals that I studied, those with power like this. But at the same time, there are countless failures as well along the way. And I think for instance, when oil is good and booming, it does legitimate kind of this free flow wildcat capitalism. But what was also instructive to me is when the bust cycles would come and consume entire communities. And rather than budging them from this, it would reinforce it. Again, the mythology of oil and what it can bring in its spectacular arrival, once again, makes sense to them, something that they can pray for, but also enduring its hardships is also something that makes sense. Their eschatology speaks to that. There is a sense that in living in oil time, it's always on borrowed time. What is left for us to do but to put our trust in a God who gives and takes, but never leaves us. So there's a way in which that legitimates too, and whether you think that's just convenience or someone trying to make sense of their world in very authentic terms, is up to you. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, I do think there's a way in which a custodial theology of land care, coming from the Quaker tradition, for example, in the case of Ida Tarbell, in which the relationship with nature is organic, one, and a relationship of oneness. This too is a powerful theology that's not, it's obviously helping her make sense of what she has experienced personally, but is also helping her form a critique that, again, it lines up, I think, her needs with her interests, with her ideas of the here and now and hereafter. So I guess I would prefer to see it generally in more, again, organic terms.
Was there any evidence of any sort of a moral dilemma among the evangelicals from the fact that incredible wealth was drawn from around the world into the North American situation?
So it kind of goes to earlier point about, was there a moral dilemma for them in terms of the global, such as R.G. Letourneau, for instance? Again, the ones that I tended to focus on were absolutely convinced that they were doing good, and it wasn't just, and this extends to the Rockefellers. I mean, for Letourneau, it was very much about needing to win lost souls to Christ and doing so by drawing them into the fold where we could teach them. For the Rockefellers, it was a little subtler, but still very much in keeping with this optimism that we are charged with this resource. It's not just a blessing, it's a burden. It's a prophetic burden. It's for us to use its money, its power to uplift society, to uplift humanity writ large. And that meant to go into these fields. Now, again, it's fraught with contradictions and complexity, and certainly in hindsight, that's what we should identify for lessons. But in their mind, for the most part, they saw themselves, and those, I worked in the papers of several Aramco executive or managers, and they saw their venture very much on the ground as one of kind of a vast modernization project with cosmopolitan products to be shared by all, economically, but also in terms of the kind of cultural, the stability, and the shared respect for monotheism too. So yeah, I guess that's where I would fall on that. Last question?
Yes, as I'm reflecting on this, I see the history you went through as an early manifestation of prosperity and gospel, and I'm wondering, do you see that connection as well?
Yeah, so the question is, do I see this as an origin of the prosperity gospel, which is especially the Pentecostal wing of evangelicalism, but that has influence in the broader movement. This notion, again, that God can bestow these great riches on us should we have enough faith in that and in Him. And yes, it very much is. And perhaps you can come tomorrow. I can say a bit more about that. But East Texas, I said earlier, 1930s, the poorest region. This is the heart of Pentecostalism. It's the heart of Church of Christ, the poorest of the poor denominations of Protestantism. And all of a sudden, they are able to build Gothic cathedrals. Not all of them, but many of them. They have derricks on their land. If that's not the prosperity gospel manifested, then I don't know what is. And again, when you get to the 1960s and 70s especially, when charismatic Christianity is going to emerge alongside and within this broader evangelical movement in the 70s, yes, it's going to be coming out of Oklahoma and Texas and out of these very communities, sponsored by leaders who, preachers like Oral Roberts, who have quite literally grown up with oil derricks in their backyard. So, yes.
Quick closing comment.
I grew up in Colombia.
Oh.
And I went to school with lots of very wealthy Texans, and people from all over the world. My friends were oil company kids. Emerald, I had one of my best friends, and the thing is, my folks worked with the middle class poor Colombians, but one of my best Colombian friends became an accountant for Ecopetrol, a Colombian-run company. I have a disc that says, well, who owes who? In other words, a lot of the Colombians said that Americans as well as Europeans sucked the wealth out of Colombia. But one of my folks' best friends was an American family, wonderful Christians. He worked with the Rockefeller Foundation. When they left, well, even when they worked there, they were giving of their wealth to the Colombians. When they left, they gave Dad this beautiful blue car. I grew up riding in an old Jeep, sideways. Dad drove that for 2 weeks and didn't feel comfortable driving a fancy car. We thought this was great for 2 weeks, but I grew up with kids who had maids, beautiful homes. There was such a contrast. So within these people that were getting lots of money, there are still kind, wonderful, giving people that are wealthy and they see the need and they help.
Thank you.
But on the other hand, too, you know, if we have, I mean, we're wealthy compared to a lot of people, and we do donate, we try to help. So I think it's not wrong to be wealthy. We need oil to survive and gas, but you've got to be careful with your wealth and to share with the world with what you have.
Thank you. It's a good point. And I very much try to show that, you know, when I give snapshots, it's hard to, but, you know, tracking generations of these families, for instance, yes, in retrospect, some of the damage done is irreparable, but at the same time, the scale of impact they had, creative impact across the globe was just astounding. So again, to measure that from both angles is absolutely important. And again, maybe that's why the book was a little long. So for that reason, trying to keep it all in the mix and in balance, and with a sympathetic eye to all players in this melodrama, if you will. So thanks.
Well, thank you again, Darren, for sharing with us tonight.